Welcome to Building Your First Bow. I am Ryan Gill of Hunt Primitive, where we entertain, educate, and inspire to help others accomplish their own primitive building and hunting goals. This video is specifically designed to help you build your first bow as quickly and concisely as possible. And while the purpose of this video is to go extremely fast, there are some really important notes that we need to cover before we start building, because I know that you're going to have a lot of questions along the way. So basically anything that's not covered in this video is irrelevant to this build. Now there's a lot of nuances that come with primitive archery and bow building, and that is better covered in either the more advanced bow making video or my book, The Secrets and Science of Building Bows and Arrows. So if you follow this quick step-by-step guide and just follow what we're talking about in this video, you'll be able to build a bow pretty darn quick. All right, first major things to cover is we're going to start off with what I recommend to be the best wood to get your start with, and that is a stave of hickory. And while hickory may not be the best performing, it is one of the most forgiving and relatively easy to work woods compared to some of the others. And I also have a video called How to Find Bow Staves, and I will drop a link to that down into the description, and so you can watch that video separately where we go out in the woods and actually look for the bow staves. But we're going to pick this video up at the point that we already have a bow stave selected and split and dried and ready to go. Now, talking about staves of wood is we must start with a stave that is dry. Now we can force dry some of the wood as we go, and we'll talk about that in a few moments, but some of the most popular ways to do this is to cut a tree, split it, and then set it up to dry for about a year. But I have a very strong suspicion that you're not going to want to wait a year after cutting a piece of wood to make your bow, so that's why we're going to talk to you about the force drying when we get to that section. A couple common questions you're going to have are, can I use a standing dead tree to make a bow from? And outside of a couple other species that you can use the heartwood, any traditional white woods you're going to use, including hickory, the answer is no. They degrade very fast when they die, so when it's cut, it needs to be processed and put up to season or to force dry. If you use something that's laying dead on the ground or standing dead, there's a very high likelihood that it's going to break. So you must start with a live tree, cut it down, and then season it in a controlled manner. Now, it must be dry again. You cannot use green wood. If you use green wood and bend it, the belly fibers of the bow will be irreversibly damaged, and it'll make for a very poor bow. But then as it dries out, it will get significantly heavier and your tiller will change. And basically at the end of the day, green wood is a hard no-go for building bows. So remember that. No standing dead, no laying dead, and no green. So you have to cut the tree while it's green and season it or force dry it. And here's a couple more really important notes, because learning this stuff now is going to save you a lot of heartache in the future. Okay, so now when you start off with finding your tree, you're going to want something that's pretty much got a minimum of about 4 inches in diameter. If when you start getting into really small saplings, let's just use this dowel rod for an example. If you get into small saplings, you might think, well, there's a lot less material to remove here, so this would make a great bow. But see, it's got a lot of crown to it. And so when you have any sort of sapling or even small tree, there is a certain amount of crown, which is the rounded portion on the outside of the tree, which is going to be the back of the bow, which is the part of the bow that faces away from you when you shoot it. And using this dowel as an example, you can see how much higher the crown is. So when you have an excessively round back of the bow, when you bend that back, it puts a tremendous amount of tension right on the top of that crown, and pow, it's going to blow up. So starting off with a really small sapling is a no-go. This is about the size that you want as a minimum. Larger trees are okay, but then they need to be continued to be split down into smaller pie section pieces. But remember, the larger the tree, the lower the crown or the flatter the back is going to be. So just keep that in the back of your mind, that you don't need a giant tree, but stick with about a 4-inch diameter tree when you pick out your stave. And the other really important point is you'll see this dark line down through the center, and that is intentionally split to that line. That's what I call the sap tube of the tree. So that is the very center of the tree as it's standing here growing. Obviously there'd be another half of the tree right here, and that is the very center core of the tree, and if this is left round and then set up for any like extended amount of time, you're going to develop cracks to that center. It's pretty much unavoidable. I think everybody's seen a log that's got cracks, deep cracks that run through it. So you must split and expose this sap tube, or else it will crack to the sap tube. So I've seen this on some smaller diameter bows where they may expose the sap tube on the limbs, but then they get down to the area on the grip, and the grip is still big and mounded up, and next thing you know, it's got a huge split right up through it because it wasn't split to the sap tube. So keep that in mind. That's another reason to have a tree that's a little bit larger, like 4 inches in diameter, and split to the sap tube. Another question you're fixing to ask is, well, what if we don't have hickory in our area? Well, then I would also recommend looking for white ash, elm, or hop hornbeam, and some of those have a couple other issues with them, but that's why I say that hickory is one of your better options, because it is very durable and relatively easier to work compared to, say, elm that has an interlocking grain. But any of those choices would be a decent choice to start with for your first bow. And I know we're getting a lot of these early questions just knocked right out of the way, and again, this is to help you have a better time building. We will get to building very shortly, I promise, but we're trying to cover all these bases because I want you to have a great experience with bow building. And honestly, if you're kind of frustrated that you can't figure out how to build a bow in 30 seconds, bow building is probably not going to be for you anyway. So, here to help you out. Now, when it comes to processing your staves, let's say you found a tree, you cut it, you split it, you use wedges, you split it in half. Now you're ready to make that decision. I'm either going to set it up and I'm going to let it dry for about a year, or you can reduce it down and set it up to dry, and it'll be dry in maybe 6 months or so, or you can reduce it down and then force dry it over the fire. Now, we're not going to show you how to force dry it in this video because I have that information already shown in my full Stone Age bow build video, and you can kind of fast forward back and forth until you find to where the bow is set up like this next to a fire, basically being force dried, and you can essentially just build a long trench fire, set this up off to the side, and continue to rotate it for a couple of days, and just have an 8-hour-long fire for a day, and that's probably enough, but I usually do 2 days, then I let it sit for a couple of days just to get a little moisture back in it, so it's not too dry, because if the wood's too dry, it'll want to break on you, but you want it very dry compared to wet wood. Now, you can cut a tree at any time of the year. It doesn't matter. Some people will say, well, this time of year is better and this time of year is better. It absolutely doesn't matter. I have made bows from trees cut in every single month of the year. There is absolutely no difference, other than a tree cut in the spring or the summer will really have the water, the sap flowing through it, and the bark will peel off very, very easily. It'll basically just come off in a big sheet, and then in the late summer, fall, and winter, then that's when the bark will stick on a little bit more and it would have to be scraped. So it's up to you how you want to season your stave, but if you leave the bark on it, then you just need to keep it in an area away from bugs so the bugs don't get into it. But for the most part, if you cut it and you put it into your shop or your shed or your garage, typically the bugs aren't going to get into it. And I often recommend sealing the tips of the stave. I did not on these ones, and it's perfectly fine, but oftentimes you can seal it using something like Elmer's glue or paraffin wax or shellac, something along those lines. If you do peel the bark, then you will need to seal the back because you're going to get a lot of drying checks up and down the back of your stave. So if you are planning on doing some long-term storage and seasoning, then I recommend cutting when the bark can stay on, but if the bark does come off, dry the back with a paper towel and then reseal it, but do not do anything to seal the belly side. So just the back. And if you get a couple drying checks, it's not the end of the world. All right, and lastly, before we put the draw knife on this and get started, obviously we're starting off with a stave that has now been sitting and drying for about a year, so you're going to see that we have hard bark removal. If you are planning on force drawing your bow, then you're going to follow all of these steps down into where the bow is reduced to a much closer to bow dimensions, and then you're going to force dry it. Don't try to force dry while it's still in this big stave form, because as that moisture on the inside heats up, it's going to find a way to expand and get out, and you're far more likely to get a lot more cracks. So you want to reduce the stave to closer to bow dimensions before force drying. But also keep in mind that the faster you dry a stave, the more likely it is to get drying checks on it. Now, those aren't necessarily the end of the world, but be aware that when you force dry, you probably will get some drying checks. And also very important is when you reduce it to bow dimensions, you are going to be very tempted to want to try to bend the bow. Do not bend the bow while it is green. As we discussed earlier, it will irreversibly damage the belly fibers of the bow, and you will never be able to recover from that. So if you bend a stave while it's green, you might as well start completely over. So I know it's tempting. Don't do it. Wait till it's dry. Now, when you're getting started on your first bow, I recommend getting a stave that's approximately 6 feet tall. Now, 6 feet is a pretty long bow, and you may not need one that's that long, but the longer the bow is, the less chance you're going to have of breaking it. So when you're starting with your first one, start with something that's 6 foot or maybe as tall as you are. Especially if you're over 6 foot, maybe cut something that's about your height. And that's a good way to start off with the bow building journey, is to start long and then work shorter later once you've established what your true draw length is. And as you'll find within the book and other videos, there's a correlation between the bow's length and your real draw length, and that's information that's included in those other places, but you don't need them necessarily in this one. What we're going to do is do a standard 6 foot long bow that's built to draw about 28 inches. Now what you're going to find is that this stave was cut when it was relatively still stripping the bark really easily, and so more times than not, if the bark can stay, you'll be able to just pop it off like this. Now this isn't normal for when it's cut in those colder months, and it's going to take a little bit more work to remove the bark, but there's a couple things here I wanted to show you that I can't show you on this one, so I'm going to have to pop out a new one and show you about the bark removal. Alright, I've pulled out a different stave that we had to actually peel the bark off with a draw knife at an earlier time, but I wanted to show you this because the white wood is what you're after, okay? But when you get the bark off of it, and you do have to be very careful taking the bark off, but what you'll find is there's this like papery brown layer underneath that also can be removed, and that is what leaves this brown streaky look. It doesn't all have to be removed, but anywhere that it's thick, it will peel off later. So you're gonna get down to a point where you start removing the bark, and it's gonna be more of this brown color, like a paper film over the entire stave, and you're gonna wonder, am I supposed to remove that too? And the answer is yes. But why this is so important is because the outer ring of this tree, and so if you are familiar with how trees have rings that grow every year, we need to follow one of those rings to along the entire back to make the bow. But that's why something like hickory or elm is your best choice to start with, because you're going to start off using the first ring of the tree. You don't have to remove any extra material other than just the bark. But as you remove the bark and scrape off the cambium layer, it is very important that you not gouge or cut into the first growth ring of the tree. So you're only removing the bark and the cambium layer, and the back of the bow must be left pristine. Now, if you accidentally take a little peel off of it, it's not the end of the world. But if you gouge this with a draw knife and you pick up a chunk out of this almost to any degree, that's going to be a weak point that your bow will likely break. In fact, just to make sure that you understand it, let's use this diagram for an example. So this would be the cross section of our stave, looking down at it from the tip. So this is the side that's obviously split. Here's the sap tube, and then here's the bark. And so as you remove the bark off of this, And then you're going to have that little bit of cambium layer, which also comes with it. You're going to be left with, you see how it's got one growth ring around. Now, if you cut into this growth ring, you can cut into it a tiny bit, and that's not going to hurt it. But when you break through it, and the back of your bow looks like this, and you've now cut through this one, this is a weak point that you can pop splinters and essentially break your bow. So you need to follow this one growth ring for the entire length. Okay? The entire length. We'll now try to make it three-dimensional. Of course, it's... If you cut through it here, you're still violating the growth ring. So we'll imagine that this is about 6 feet long looking down the stave. If you're cleaning all this up and say you take a big gouge out of here somewhere and now it has busted through to this other growth ring, like we mentioned here, that's a weak point where it's going to pop. But again, that's why we're using something like hickory, where you don't need to worry about chasing a ring or removing material to get down to a lower ring. It's just remove the bark. But this outside first ring needs to remain pristine, like on this one here, because that's the integrity of the back of your bow, which is the side of the bow that is going to face away from you when you are holding it and shooting it. So we ended up switching staves so you could actually see a little bit of this cambium removal, and that white wood is what we're after, and this dark papery layer, that's the cambium that still needs to be removed. So this is a stave that was seasoned with the cambium on, and depending on your skill level with the draw knife, you want to be very careful and very lightly peel that cambium layer, just being careful not to get down into the white wood. When you start seeing a little bit of that white showing up, or you're not able to grab that papery cambium very well, switch to using this as a scraper. So you see how it highlights those little spots. Now don't sit and over scrape to the point that you're going to scrape a lot of the white wood away and violate that ring, but you can just scrape until you start exposing, and say something around like this little knot. We're going to be a little more careful around that. That little knot's not going to hurt anything. And remember, it does not all have to be removed. Some people actually like to leave a little bit of this on for kind of that natural camouflage look. And so that's going to be how you're going to remove the cambium that's underneath the bark before we start reducing the stave into closer to bow dimensions. Alright, now use a tape measure and find the center of your bow. And that's going to be exactly the middle of your handle. Okay, so split the difference in two, mark a line, that's your center. Okay, normally I don't run a lot of specific measurements. I build by eye, but I also know I need to give you at least something to kind of go off of since it's your first bow. So then do about 3 inches out. You can make a light line here, and then at the 6-inch mark. So you're looking at a 6-inch handle, which we'll be able to trim that down a little bit later. I'd rather leave a little extra meat on, and then we can refine it later. Now, as far as the width of your limbs go, this one right here is just a tad bit thicker than I would want to suggest starting off with. And you can draw a line there, but for the most part, as you work down, all the stave's going to be a little bit different thicknesses. Now, the reason that I don't draw it out and cut it is because following the grain on the outside of the limbs of the bows is pretty darn important. It's not as important with hickory as it is with a wood, say like Osage, but it's still important, and it's a good practice to carry. So if you want to draw lines all the way down it, that's fine, but also use that as more of a guideline rather than a strict paint by numbers, follow the line direction. And so for that sake, I will draw lines on this one, and then I will show you how I negotiate those lines when I'm removing material from the side of the stave. So I have drawn lines on the bow, and I'll show you a little bit closer in a moment. But what I'm essentially doing is I'll look at the grain, and if the grain looks like it's got a little bit of a jog around what was this knot on the side of the tree, I'm going to follow that grain with my outline, which again, I usually follow that by eye, but I think it is important for your first one to draw, to give yourself a guideline. And so I would shoot for 2 inches at the max, 1 3/4 at the minimum as your starting line. If your stave happens to not be that wide, that's okay. You can get this as narrow as maybe 1.5 inches before it starts really becoming any sort of a problem. And then I'm going to do mostly parallel out to about here, maybe a slight taper, especially with hickory. We can get away with a slight taper. And then finishing off to about 1 inch is what we're going to be looking at. But right now you could stick with 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches out at the end. So again, you can just draw these lines on, and then we'll show you how the line the grain may not strictly follow the line, but we could still use the lines as somewhat guidelines. So just kind of keep that in mind, that you'll be looking at, about 1 3/4 inches at here, and then running parallel to maybe about 8 or 10 inches from the tip, and then we'll taper that back down to about 1 inch. And in this case, we're going to make more of a Cherokee inspired type of bow with the diamond nocks, a little bit larger tips. You can adjust the tips as you need, but I really like that design, and I think it's perfect for your first hickory flat bow design. All right, so now we're talking about laying out the side profile. Now you can see I drew this handle to be significantly smaller, and again, I'm going to end up shortening it up quite a bit at the end of this. I just give myself a little bit of room to work with, and as of right now, I'd say I'm about 1.5 inches right here, and that'll even be trimmed down more because I'm going with more of a Cherokee inspired. Now I know some people are going to want to have a larger handle with a cut-in shelf and all that. That's fine if you want to do that and kind of wing that on your own, or watch a more advanced one. That's perfectly fine. But what I'm going to do here is we're going to go with something without a shelf and it has a smaller handle, because it's an easier task for you to capture on your first build. Now, the lines that we're drawing here on the side, I'm going to say shoot for about 1 inch right here, and then out at the tip about 3/4 inch. And that's going to get reduced down more, but I don't want you to take too much off now. So now we'll be able to remove this material off the belly first. Then, once that material is removed, then we'll be able to come in and take the stuff off of the sides. And the reason that I typically say remove it off the belly of the bow first is you're less likely to grab grain and accidentally run into your bow if your bow's a lot more narrow. So I typically say remove it off the belly first and then come in and true up your sides a little bit. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to move on to removing that. All right, next I move on to working with a chopper. This is one made by Jason Smith at Hobo Forge. He's a good friend of mine and makes a heck of a nice bow making chopper. And what I'm going to do is start chopping and removing the material. Remember, only from the back of the bow, or the belly of the bow. We never take anything ever at this point off of the back of the bow, which is the point, again, that faces away from you when you hold the bow to shoot it. And I start at the grip, and then I work on chopping and peeling down. Now you can remove this with nothing but a draw knife, but it's going to take you a lot longer to do, and that's why I like the chopping method, and I handle a chopping knife better than a hatchet. But honestly, you can use anything you want to use. Now a lot of people, if they've got a bandsaw, they're really tempted to throw it on here. Now if you can remove a chunk of material with the bandsaw, then I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I would highly recommend not going all the way to your line, because it's very easy to lay this on a bandsaw and cut and think you're doing a great job, and next thing you know, you turn it over here and you've ended up cutting it way too close on this side. I have seen more staves ruined by bandsaws than anything else. And so that's why I say if you want to just remove some material, that's fine, but I got all of my bow making start by chopping every one of these bows into shape. And so I start up with a grip, and I don't try to remove it all at once. I get a nice splinter to run. So we're going to chop until we start to establish a good splinter. And then I start to torque my elbow out, chop, and continue to remove just like that. And then I'll come in and I'll get another one. And oftentimes it's not flat. Sometimes I work on the corner edges. But try not to get too big of a bite all at once, because otherwise it'll be hard to flip your arm out. You'll see as I chop and turn my elbow, and there's a knot right here you can see, so you just kind of power through that knot, chop it, and that's why you can walk it all the way down. And so you're going to do that essentially until you've reached the marks that you've drawn or close thereof. Definitely don't go past your marks, but you can work on getting it pretty darn close. And this is one of the reasons, again, that I recommend hickory, is because this grain splits off fairly easily compared to something like elm. If you're familiar with elm at all, like for firewood, you'll know how difficult it is to split because of the interlocking grain. It makes a great bow, not much better really than hickory, but the wood is much tougher to work. So also, as you're working, if you are working on a hard surface like concrete, put down a piece of wood, because what will happen is you'll eventually start to drive splinters up from the bottom of your stave as well. So go ahead and work all that out, and then we'll catch back up when we are at closer dimensions. Alright, we got it thinned out, but you can see that the back profile is still straight, so now we're going to chalk it up in the vise and start thinning the side profile a little bit. At this point, I like to use a little piece of leather in between it, just so we don't mar it up too much. And you actually may be familiar, if you've watched my other stuff, that I don't usually use a vise, that I do a lot of work pitting it against the floor and working it. And I decided to work with a vise this time around simply because I know most of you at home are going to want to put this thing into a vise to work on it. So that's why we're working on that today. Having a nice vise that has some overhang over a workbench is a great idea. Alright, so you can see that the line that we drew on here, and past this I've already kind of caught it up. So I want to show you how we're going to work down to it. And we're going to use the draw knife to follow the grain. And that's a great point about your draw knife. I don't like it super hair shaving, popping, sharp. What it needs to be is a little bit sharp, but kind of dull, because you want this to follow the grain rather than cutting through the grain. So if it's super sharp, you'll shave through the grain. And so what we're going to be doing is working on getting a little bit, you'll see as you start to develop where the grain is, it'll pop out really easily. Okay, then as you get closer to where the grain is, notice that it starts following longer strips. Okay, so once you've established that grain and it stops pulling a whole bunch of little short ones, then you can get up and usually get a little bit bigger bite and actually walk it out a lot further. Okay, so don't try to get it all at once. If you try to just hook onto it here and rip it and follow that line and pull through it, you're probably going to mess up and it's going to dig in. So it's a little bit at a time, okay, until it starts to establish itself. Then that draw knife will follow the grain. So that's what I mentioned before, that I don't care so much about following this line. See how we're close to it here, still far from it here? I don't care about the line. The line is a rough guideline. What I care about is following the natural grain of the stave. And so that's where you hook onto a piece and you keep working it and let the draw knife and the stave work together. See how we can pull some longer pieces off of this now? Long curls. And that's because we have found the natural grain of this now. So that's letting the draw knife and the stave do the work for you, as opposed to trying to muscle through spots to find your line. Because what happens is, if you just cut this out or you carve it out to be straight, you'll have a lot of different grain violations along the way, which will make your bow weaker when you bend it. Okay, so we've got our back profile sorted out, right? So when you start looking at it, we've thinned it down now along the sides. And remember, we thinned the belly side first, but then this is why I told you to leave it a little bit thick anyway. But now what you'll notice is as you thin the sides, especially with a little bit of crown on the back, is it's going to start actually making your limbs look thicker. So these are significantly thicker than we need for a bending bow. And so now it's time to basically go back to the chopping and very just finely chop this a little bit smoother. Okay, just reduce a little bit of material, and then we're going to put it back in the vise, and then we can draw knife the belly a little bit. And if you just want to start draw knife in the belly at this point, that's fine. It might take you a little bit longer, but we're going to talk about reducing the belly, getting close to a floor tiller stage in this bow. Now, if you were to cut a green stave and it is still green, remember this one is seasoned, okay? If you are to the point, this point right now, and it is still a green stave, now is when you're going to want to switch over and do the force firing by a fire. And so I'm going to include a little clip of that to just show what I'm talking about, but essentially it's just making a trench fire and setting this up and rotating it once in a while and letting it go for about 8 hours in the day, give or take, and then also letting it cool down overnight, start the fire back up, and do it again. You will dry that out, and I don't mean getting it close to the fire. You can be a few feet from the fire. When you've got a fire going and you can stand here and feel that heat coming off of it, that's going to be drying it out. What you'll hear is you'll be able to hear the wood actually hissing and sizzling as it's getting rid of the moisture. If you get it too hot too fast, then it stands a greater chance of cracking. Now, you're probably going to, in the force drying process, develop some cracks, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the bow is ruined. And I'm going to show you why here in 1 second. So here's a bow that was force dried, and I don't know if you guys can really see it, but I think you probably can. There's actually some drying checks in this. And so this is one that we aggressively heat treated and dried by the fire, and it's got a lot of little drying checks in it, yet this bow works very, very well. Don't have a problem with it at all. This bow is actually finished. It's not finished, but it's tillered and it's shooting. And this is really what you're after right here. So if you do get drying checks on the back, it doesn't mean that your bow is ruined unless you get some really, really, really major ones and then they actually have a lot of grain run out. But typically when it comes to these drying checks, these little cracks, they follow the grain. Okay, they usually don't go across the grain, they usually follow the grain. So if they run out, that typically means you didn't follow the grain in the previous step that we were talking about. So if you follow the grain the way we did on this one, when we worked out the back profile, when it dry checks, it should follow the grain and you shouldn't have any run out or very minimal run out. But again, the idea is most people don't want those drying checks in it, but if you do get some, it's not the end of the world. Just continue on with your build. But since this stave has already been seasoned, we're going to go ahead and reduce the belly on it, and we're going to jump into that stage. I'll chop it down a little bit thinner, and then we'll clean it up with the draw knife, and then we'll move on to floor tillering. Okay, we've got the limbs thinned back out, so we chopped a little bit more, and so now it's time to clean this up. But this is a really important point here that I'd like to share with some of you guys. You'll see a lot of guys, they talk about using a wood rasp, and I think a wood rasp has an important role, especially if you don't have a power sander or something, and it's going to really be in the grip. And I'm one that advocates against using a wood rasp in the working limb. I'll use it a tiny bit just to show you what I'm talking about. So I get how this is an easy way to almost rough sand out and remove material, and I really appreciate it. But let's focus on this point right here, and then let me tell you why I don't use one. So let's see if you can see that right there. So you see all the really deep gouges that a wood rasp puts in. So now you can work this out and tiller it, And what you'll find is you'll get to a certain weight of the bow that you're happy with, and it'll be tillered, and then you're going to have to come and remove all of this later. You're going to have to sand this out. And by the time you actually sand through all these deep gouge marks, you're going to end up losing weight and throwing your tiller off, which we haven't talked about tiller yet, but that's coming, relatively soon in the build. But the reason I don't use one is, yes, it is effective in removing material, but you're going to later come through and scrape and sand and remove more material, and your bow is more than likely going to result in a lighter weight than you are shooting for. So if you specifically want to use a rasp, then go for it. I'm not going to say that you're wrong for using it, but those are the reasons I don't. I use the draw knife, and basically all the chop marks that we made, you can get a hold of with the blade of the draw knife. And so I pull over. This leaves the belly smooth. So when you remove material like this, I can go over top of even those rasp marks, removing a fair amount of material. And that's why I was willing to use the rasp on it, because we still are going to remove some material here. So it's kind of a no harm, no foul. But you'll also find when you have these chop marks, and even when you use a draw knife, if you use it the same direction as the chop marks all the time, it'll make them worse. So as you're using the draw knife, I recommend that you change the direction periodically. So you can use it straight, you can tilt it this way a little bit, this way a little bit, and that will help get rid of chatter marks and little cuts from chopping, and you won't make those worse. So you'll notice if you watch me use it, I'll use it this way a while, then I turn it this way, and I'm almost using it as a hand plane to some degree, except I can change the angle and I can change the pitch in which I pull. And what that is going to do is it's going to leave a much smoother surface as you get into the tillering stage, as opposed to a rasp that's going to have a lot of gouge marks in it. This will be a much smoother surface, and then as you tiller and fine tune, you're going to turn the draw knife up at more of a 90-degree angle, and using your thumbs, push to scrape. And it's the same thing. You'll notice you'll get these like little scrape chatter marks, and change the direction of your tool, and you can plane over top of them and smooth them out. So this way you're kind of smoothing the bow at the same time that you're removing material. So then this way your sanding job later is going to be less, and you're not going to have to worry about losing the weight whenever you come back through to try to sand out all the marks that you got from that big old gnarly wood rasp. So we're thinned out pretty good, and we're ready to start the floor tillering process. And I know we're going to get some questions on what thicknesses to shoot for. And I'll tell you, at this point, you're looking at maybe 5/8, a skosh under right here, and then down to, ½ inch or so right here on a gradual taper. Okay, now I can't tell you have to get those exact measurements. If you come at this with an engineering background and you're trying to put calipers on it to make sense, it's not going to make sense. And the reason is every single tree is different, and even throughout the tree there's going to be differences in ring thickness or grain density. And so if you try to make it really by the numbers all the way down, you're going to be really, really disappointed, because even if you were modeling one bow after the next one, you could put them to the exact same specifications, but because wood is different, one bow could be significantly heavier than the other one, and the tiller could be completely off. So this is where primitive bow making is really different than most other materials, because natural wood like this doesn't play by the same rules as everybody else. So keep that in mind when I give you those measurement thicknesses and even the widths on the back. Those are, again, general guidelines to go go by. It's going to take some practice to figure out what feels good to you. But now we're at the floor tillering stage, and that's when I put it on that block of wood, and we're not going to bend it really far. In fact, it's still quite heavy at this point, but as I bend, I just want to see a little bit. I'm not trying to really bend it. You can break a bow doing that at this point because you're not really ready to fine tune it yet. But you just want a little bit of bend, and you're going to watch down the limb and say, where is it bending and where is it not bending? And right now it looks a little bit stiff here, so I'll be able to come through and scrape a little bit more material out of here. And then I can floor tiller this side. And I would say it's actually looking like it's bending pretty well here. It might be a little stiff up here, so I'll remove a little bit right there. Now this part takes some practice. It really does. The floor tillering and tillering in general, you're going to find it's just going to take practice and developing an eye for what you're looking for. So again, I'm a little stiff in here. I can see that. And then when I flip it over, I'm bending good there, but I'm a little stiff in here. So I'm going to go continue to scrape. I'm not going to draw a knife. I'm going to scrape material from here and then from out here. A little bit more scraping. Still not going to be perfect. You can't perfect it at this stage, but I'm getting some bend that I want out of it, and it's still quite heavy, which is good. So I think we're going to move on to cutting in the nocks, and again we're going to be doing some more Cherokee inspired diamond nocks, so I'll show you how to do those next on the list. Okay, time to work on a nock. So we've done a kind of a traditional Cherokee inspired diamond nock here. It's a really easy one for folks to do. If you want to change the look of your nock, that's fine. If you want to make it more rounded, in fact this is still pretty wide, but the reason I chose that is because then you got some room to play with. If you end up accidentally getting a little bit thinner, there's nothing wrong with that. You can actually get pretty darn skinny with your nocks, but the reason I'm kind of pitching you this direction is you got a little bit of room for error if you need to come back later and maybe work a little bit off to the side on one. So anyway, I'm going to take a chainsaw file, and if you want to draw it on there to wherever you think your nocks are going to be, I don't start to try to wallow out the whole thing. I just am going to try to make 2 lines, and when I make them, I'm not going straight across. So this is the back of the bow. This is the point that faces away from you. So when you're shooting it, so instead of going straight across, what I'm going to do is actually angle it back towards the belly, because when the bow is strung, I don't necessarily want the string to make this really hard angle. It's going to take some angle, but I'll go back a little bit and then I'll start to turn. And so we'll start to do it at an angle like that, if you can see it. So this is the belly of the bow, and then this is the back of the bow. And once that's established, then it's just a matter of working it back and forth. Until it's fully cut in. You can see there. And then we'll be ready to do the other side. So an important point here is do not cut along the back. Okay, so you see that that's a beginner's mistake I see all the time, is they want the groove to go all the way around. And if you cut into the back, that is then going to create a weak point that'll shear your knock off. So only on the sides, and then angling it back. And there's not a huge science to it. Just avoid taking material off the back. You can slightly round into it. That's perfectly fine. Okay, so it should look like that. Then we'll go ahead and do the other side, and then we'll catch up with creating the diamond shaped knock here, cutting these edges off. Alright, both sides are cut in, so now we're going to take a sharp knife and just obviously be kind of careful with it, but a good sharp knife helps. You don't want to run really hard to where you start splitting the other side of the knock. That's why I started a corner and just kind of gently start whittling that away. And you can put a saw on it, obviously. However, I have found that a knife gives me a little bit more control in getting the diamonds even, and the knife really doesn't take very long, as you're going to see as I'm basically talking you through the process here. So I can really whittle that first. There we go, perfect. Whittle that first little spot out. You can always take your file too, and you'll be able to clean that up just a little bit. Now, on the top end, it's kind of the same thing. If you've got a sander and you want to buzz it on that, that's perfectly fine. But a good sharp knife, you'll be able to whittle that away. And honestly, about the same amount of time it's going to take you to get up out of your chair and walk over to a sander and turn it on, you can pretty much have that whittled right off. And we'll be ready to go. So there you go, that's one side done. That's why we chose this knock, because it's really fast and easy and kind of hard to mess up. We'll go ahead and do the other side. And then we'll cut the nocks on the other side of the bow. Just clean it up and round your edges a little bit, and you'll be good to go. So you don't have to, like I said, don't cut all the way across the back, but it doesn't hurt to round it over and bevel it in just a little bit. All right, we're getting really close to the tillering stage, and I'll show you the tiller tree here behind me in just a few minutes. But now that the bow is roughed out and kind of floor tillered, it's time to start looking down it and determining what the top limb is. Now, you'll notice almost every single bow is going to have a little bit of sideways warp to it. That's really normal. Now, you could spend some time heating it up and straightening it out, and you do need to do that, but only if it's really bad. And so how do you know what really bad is when you look down it, do the center of the tips, when you can draw a metal line right down from the center of the tip to the center of the tip, is it outside of the handle? If it's like right at the edge or outside, then you need to heat this up. That's a different video. We've got some heat correcting videos and information in the book. But you heat this stuff up and you're going to have to bend it over. Now, this one here is probably just about perfect because it lines up right about here. And so that's how we're going to determine our top limb from our bottom limb. Okay, so the side that we say the string favors, so when we look down it and the string is going to run over here, this is what I call the side the string favors. That's going to be the side that the arrow goes on. So if you are a right-handed archer and you hold the bow with your left hand and draw with your right hand, the arrow on this side, then that's going to be our top limb, and then that's why I mark that as such. So now I know that that's going to be the top limb. If you were left-handed, shooting, holding it with your right hand, drawing with your left, then you'd flip this whole thing over and build it for the arrow to go on this side. So now if you're one of the rare people that shoots right-handed or left-handed but with the arrow on the other side, again, treat it not so much, it's not so important on which hand you're holding it with, but rather put the arrow on the side that the string favors. And that is going to make your bow a lot less picky in its arrow spine that it shoots. So it'll shoot a larger array of arrows. So don't worry about trying to make it perfectly straight unless it's outside of the handle. Leave it and then choose that for the side that the arrow goes on. And you're going to find out why that's important as soon as we get to tillering, because once we determine what the top limb is, we're going to make the top limb a little bit weaker than the bottom limb, and we'll explain that during tillering. Let's talk real quick about the tillering tree, and this is what we do to adjust the limbs so they bend evenly. And so we can actually bend the bow by standing back and watching how the limbs work and bend, and then remove material from various places so we get a nice even arc within the bow. And so this is what's called the tillering tree. I like to set it up to be about eye level with where the bow is going to sit on top, and then that way I'm not looking at the bow at any weird angles. Now, the measurements, I typically start at 20 and I do 1 inch increments down to 33 just because we build bows in all different draw lengths. And that's measured from the very top of this, which is 2 inches taller than the base right here on the inside, that the bow sits on. And so that way when the bow sits on here, we're measuring from the back of the bow. Now, a lot of handles are not a full 2 inches. Some of them are, some of them aren't. In this case, you'll notice that it probably doesn't come up to the top. So you just have to add that on to the number down here. So if you're going to pull to 28 inches, and we were, say, a 1/2 inch short, we would just pull a 1/2 inch further. Got it? Okay, now what it is, 2x4 screwed to a stud in the wall, the lines 2 inches apart, and then 6 inches and 6 inches. And that's just how I kind of do it. And those are just lines of reference for me to be able to look at tip alignment, and it's just a visual as opposed to just trying to go off of a level eye. This gives me 2 different level points to gauge the bow's bend off of. And then we have a heavy low stretch rope with a dog leash style of clip that we're going to put on the bowstring. But I've got a little nail that I hang it on there. It goes down to a pulley that's on the floor, goes under the pulley, and then out to a handle so I can stand back and pull, as you'll see in a moment, to flex. And then I've got some little shims that you'll see me occasionally putting in to level the bow out. So I'll use shims on one or both sides to level. And so this is going to give us that opportunity to watch that bow bend, and then we know where to remove material. This is what's known as a tiller string, and it's just a long string, extra long for the bow. The size of it doesn't specifically matter to me. This is just giving me a rough baseline on how the bow bends before I put a tight string on it. And so obviously it's got a loop on either end that sits over the bow nocks, drapes down in the middle, and we hook the clip on it and we're ready to go. And we step back and we can just start pulling a couple inches, just a little bit, watching how those limbs bend. If it looks like it's bending too much in one area, then we obviously have to remove wood from basically everywhere else except that area. And if it looks a little tight in a spot, then we can remove material from there. And as I pull the bow, I can see it's a little bit stiff on the left limb, right about here. It's not real bad, just a little stiff. Watch right there. So what I can do is we'll take this down and we'll just shave off a little bit more material and we'll try it again. So we repeat this process until we can bend the bow to where the tips are just past, maybe an inch past the first 6-inch line. That means it's pretty well safe that we can put a tight string on it. So you'll probably notice when working hickory, it's very common that your bow is going to take some set or string follow, meaning rather than being perfectly straight, after you start to bend it, it's not going to go back to perfectly straight and it's going to retain some of that bend. Now, a lot of people don't like that. However, there's a lot of good bows out there that have string follow, so don't worry about it too much. Now, there are some advanced things that we can do to help mitigate that, but that's also going to significantly increase the likelihood of you ruining your first bow. And since this is a build your first bow tutorial, we're going to skip that stuff and we're just going to use the raw hickory the way it is until you get a handle on the basics. So expect to have some string follow, but that's not the end of the world. There's some good bows out there with string follow. So I just wanted to discuss that with you because I expect that you're going to see some set in your limbs and you're going to be worried about it. And it's really not a big deal at this time. Within this tillering process, every time we pull it down about another inch, and this is whether it's on the long string or the short string, we're going to be able to examine the limbs. Now you have to take into effect that there are oftentimes little knots or bumps. Like this has a natural little wave to it. So you have to consider that when you're looking at how the limb bends. It's not just simply, does it look bent there, but when you work the limbs, is it actually bending in that area the appropriate amount? And when you start to pull to a 1-inch increments, when you can't find anything else to fix, then you can go ahead and pull up the next and start exercising those limbs. And then once you can't find anything else to fix, or if you have, you pull it off and you make your scrapes as we showed earlier, and then you can pull it to the next. Now it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect at this stage, but you want it pretty close. But if you try to get it perfect now, it's going to fall out of perfect in the next inch or two anyway. So just get it kind of close like here, and then we're ready to put a tight string on this one. Now we're ready for our short string, and when choosing a string, you're going to look for a string that's approximately 4 inches shorter than the distance between your nock, not the overall tip of the bow, but the nock to the nock. Take that, knock about 4 inches off of it, and that should give you your approximate string length. Now, we're not going to discuss making strings in this video, but I will drop some links down in the description on making your own bowstring, either from modern, like a B50 material, or we do a lot of strings that are primitive materials, sinew, yucca, etc. So we'll make sure we drop some links down to making your own bowstring, but for now, maybe just order one or use some paracord to get you started. It would have to be some good quality paracord, mind you, but I wouldn't keep that as your forever bowstring. However, now that we've got our string, we'll go ahead and string this up nice and gentle. We don't want to over bend any of our limbs, so we're just going to keep the string tight, and I'll show that to you again. So I'm going to keep the string pulled tight, and as I bend this, I'll push this up, and the string is always tight. So if you over bend the bow to where it's really loose and the string's really slack, you're putting way too much tension on your limbs, and a very good chance you'll either damage or break them. Once we've leveled the bow back out, now you'll be able to look at this first 6-inch line and gauge it off of your string. And they should run parallel, or the top limb have just a tiny bit more bend to it. And you'll notice in this case, also it looks like it's bending a little bit too much right here. Remember that that is that natural little wavy spot in the wood. So it's always going to look like it's bending a little bit too much there. But as you'll see, we need to remove just a little bit of material right here and maybe a tiny bit at the tip. I don't think we're going to touch this area right now until maybe we get down to a further draw and see if it's not working. But as we stand back, you'll be able to see that the right limb, which is our top limb, does need just a little bit of material removed to give us that slight extra bend that we're looking for in the top limb. So at this point, I leave the bow strung, and I will push it against the wall like this. I've got a board down here, and then I will use the draw knife to scrape, and I will scrape this out. All right, as we pull, so you'll start relatively short. You don't need to pull very far at first, and just continue to watch the limbs bend, and you're going to continue to work down inch by inch till you get to about that 20 mark. So of course we've kind of sped it up a little bit, and I'm pretty happy with it right there. Also remember, I'm looking for a little bit more bend on that top limb, which is the right limb. So right now, looking at say a 20-inch draw, I can look it over really good. If I think it looks really good, I can go to 21. And then if I look at it and say I think it needs a little bit more material removed, then I'll stop and I can scrape some more, and you're going to continue this process until you get to the draw length that you're looking for. Tillering is something that takes a lot of practice, and this video is going to make it look like it's going by very quickly. When you're first getting started and tillering your first bow, it should probably take you a few hours to tiller it. Because I do so many, I can tiller a complete bow in usually about 30 minutes, but that's also because I've done several hundred of them. So expect that this process could take you several hours, and you're still going to make some mistakes along the way. But that's one of the reasons that we like hickory, is because it is very forgiving. So if you do make a mistake, oftentimes you can kind of catch up without the bow breaking. So expect to slow down and take your time on this part of your bow building journey. If you'll notice that our right limb, our top limb, is about an inch away from touching our bottom 6-inch line. And this one is about 1.5 inches or so. Watch it again. And that's about what I shoot for. I like to have a little softer, a little weaker top limb. The reason for that is when you're stringing your bow, you're typically stringing it by bending the bottom limb. And over time, I've seen a lot of bows take excessive set on the bottom limb. So when we're building the bow, we make the top limb a little bit weaker. So as this happens over time, it catches up. We're down now to about 26 inches, and you'll notice that we're getting maybe a little bit of excessive bend now in this one, but instead of running right to it and removing material from here, reset the level on your bow. And we're not setting the level looking at the string in relation to the line on the wall. I'm setting it as to the limbs in relation to the top line. So always make sure to reset it, just to make sure that your eyes are not playing tricks on you and that the bow isn't walking around. And notice that actually made the problem a lot less severe. So as you draw this bow back and forth, it may just walk off to one side or the other ever so slightly. That's looking fairly decent at 26 inches. And there's another note here to point, and that is, don't try to improve it to death, especially on your first bow. If you've got some pretty severe hinges, you need to fix them, but you'll notice that there's no real severe hinges. And a hinge is going to be a spot that when the limb starts to bend, it really bends heavy in one spot. And those are the things that you want to avoid, because that will ruin or break your bow. So notice again how these limbs bend without hinges. And although the tiller is not perfect, it's nice and gentle and sweeping. In fact, I would look at it and say it's a little bit stiff in here and here yet. This is one of the last places that I want to remove material, because this area makes the biggest impact in the limb's amount that it bends. So this is under the most tension in here, because of all the leverage of the limb pulling down. So that's one of the last things that I will perfect. So at 26 inches, we're looking pretty good. And I definitely want to take some out of these inner fades, and that'll get us to probably our 27 and then 28 inch mark. Then keep in mind, we're a little bit below our line, so we're actually going to go to about 28.5 on here, which will give us a true 28 inch draw from the back of the bow. Now we're ready to make our final adjustments. You'll be able to watch it again. We're going to remove a little bit more material here, and I believe it was here, but I'll double check that. Yep, I'm going to take a little bit out of here first, which is going to make this limb bend a little bit more. We'll have to compensate by taking a little out of here as well. All right, that's looking pretty decent. The camera angle, I think, for you guys is a little bit off because I have to stand right in front of it. So it might be slightly skewed for you. But notice where our limb comes down. Top limb's just a little bit weaker, which I like. I wouldn't even hurt my feelings to have it a little bit weaker yet. We've got about 1/2 inch more on that side. It's got pretty good bend. I wouldn't say it's perfect. Now keep this in mind as you shoot this bow, and we're going to get on to making or shaping the grip in a moment. But when you get on to shooting this bow, the tiller will kind of settle in and adjust. Don't perfect it yet. Get it close. Let's get the handle done, and then go out and shoot it a while. Then over the period of the next couple days or a week, come back and you can look at the tiller and make any adjustments as needed. So now I'm putting a bow scale on it, and I'm going to measure the weight. The weight on this one is 63 pounds at 28 inches. We really haven't done any discussion on weights, and that's for a very specific reason. You don't really know what weight you're shooting for and what that feels like in the floor tiller stage until you have a few bows under your belt. So try to keep it a little bit stiff, a little bit hard to bend, because the stiffer the bow is, the more mistakes you can make in the tillering process and still come out with a relatively heavy bow. 63 pounds is probably too heavy for most beginning archers, and you might be wanting to shoot for the 50-55 pound range. Shoot a little bit heavy because you're probably going to lose some weight. It is not uncommon for beginner bowyers to end up with bows that are in the 20 to 30 pound range. That's very, very common. So don't stress it. Remember, this is your first bow. You probably are going to have more under your belt in the future because it's pretty addicting. So anyway, we're going to take this and we're going to shape the grip, and then we'll be getting ready to finish this thing up. I have a couple more visuals for you here on the whiteboard just to understand a little bit more about the tiller. Obviously, you're looking for a really uniform arc, as uniform as possible. And you'll also notice that I don't like my tips to bend a whole lot to about the last 8 inches because it can really promote this whip tillering, and I really don't like the way that that feels. And to me, it makes my arrows fly a little bit more erratic. I would rather them stay a little bit stiff. Now, when we were talking about hinges, like in here or here, that's what a hinge is, where it bends and then you have one spot that excessively bends. And oftentimes that hinge is followed by a stiff area or has a stiff area ahead of it. And the only way to fix that is going to be remove material here and remove material here, which is going to make that limb way weaker. So then you have to remove material over this entire limb to even it back out. So these are things that you don't want to look for. A big stiff area right here with a little bit of whip tillering, and then a heavy hinge here at the handle. And then out here, you'd be looking at a little hinge by the handle, a stiff area, and then out on the outer third limb, another hinge. This is not going to be a good long-lasting bow for you. Hickory might put up with that. This to me is a big solid no-go. I really dislike that all the way around. Great recipe to blow the tips off the bow. This, very good likelihood it's going to break right here. That again is what you're looking for. And that simply just takes time and practice to get a good eye and feel for it. So we're ready to start shaping the grip, and this is what we marked as our top limb. So I like to come up and put a little dot a little higher up, just so I know that this is in fact the top limb, because I'm going to essentially erase all of this. Now, I like to use a knife and chop it and carve it, and I think this is a good fast method for me. But one of the things that you need to be cautious of as you do this, you can taper in the back here a little bit to the handle, but you don't obviously want to remove any material up here. But the handle doesn't bend. As long as your handle is stiff, it's got a static handle, you can remove in and remove some corner material off. But if you continue to hit this and drive it, you'll end up driving it all the way down. So this is where I flip the bow over and I catch it up in the middle, and then same thing, flip it over, and I'll work it back and forth to get some rounding in the handle. But you always want to make sure that when you're chopping, you don't end up getting a splinter that runs down in. So that's a kind of a dangerous thing to do, but I chop almost all of mine out just because it removes a lot of material quickly. Okay, so that was, we had a lot to get rid of there, so I didn't mind taking that big chunk off. And you can round it up pretty good. And once you get some of the material removed, that's when we can switch over to the wood rasp and really round that grip in to where it fits well for you. So using your wood rasp, you can really round it out. Now just be cautious when you come to the back. I don't recommend rasping this way, as it can possibly grab some splinters and pull them up on the back especially. So when you're working from the back, work from the back into the handle. And that might save you from lifting any splinters that could run up into the working limb of your bow. Now you can thin this out pretty far, but it's just going to take some time, and you can work it out as far as you're comfortable. Now I like to take a sharp paring knife and scrape out all of the scratch marks from either the draw knife or from the rasp, and you can do this all over the entire bow. Even the back, you can come in and scratch out some of your pencil marks, any of your lines, and also round your edges just a little. They don't need to be super round, but you just want to take that square edge off and scrape out any tooling marks, obviously working with the grain. When you're working on the back, it's okay to remove a little bit of material, but definitely be cautious that you're not over scraping in an area and could violate a ring and then later break your bow. So scrape the entire bow out so you get it nice and smooth, and then you can finish it off with, I like to use 100 grit sandpaper, obviously with the grain. And then when if you want to buff it down even more, you can switch to a 350 grit sandpaper and then steel wool, and then you can finish this bow with just about any sealer that you want. Shellac, lacquer, polyurethane, you name it, it'll pretty much work. So at this point you can just finish your bow out. You can add some stain to it if you would like. Now it's pretty much all up to you. And this should set you up for you to build a lot of bows in the future. So notice how far we've been able to take that handle down and really round it up so it's comfortable in the hand. So we were able to narrow it in because the handle's thick, and wherever the handle starts to thin out, that's where it needs to go back to the same thickness or width of the rest of your limb. So you can taper it in, but it's also with the taper of the handle. So anywhere you have that extra mass, you can remove some material. Hopefully you had a great experience building your first bow, and I hope for you that it is one of many. And if you enjoyed this one, make sure to watch some of our more advanced bow making tutorials, whether it's the full Stone Age build or the build your Osage bow. And then also be sure to check out the book, The Secrets and Science, not only of primitive archery, that has a lot to do with all aspects of primitive archery, but the secrets and science of building bows and arrows. And you'll be off and running on making some great quality bows in the future.